Noel, for the Net on Radio 1, which of your 3 awards is most important to you?
None of them. They're all voted for by idiots in ponytails with dicky bows on.
What about the one voted by fans, though?
The one voted for by the fans means a lot. Anything that's voted for by fans is special. Anything that's voted for by idiots, corporate pigs, means nothing to us.
In 1995, a band fronted by 2 squabbling brothers from Burnage unleashed a record which would come to define the entire decade. While only their second album, What's the Story Morning Glory transformed indie rockers Oasis into the biggest band in Britain.
They embraced the culture, which is our culture, which was pop music from the 60s and the 70s, and they brought it to a fore, which was like working class lads from Manchester, from Burnage, you know, to do this, you know, make this music, and it was real, it was real, it was street music, which was really important. It was as real as hip-hop is.
There's always one album, isn't there, that the sort of 30 years on the kids will be kind of going back to find out what their parents were listening to.
There is an entire generation, literally an entire generation of British people who could probably hum every track off that record, and whether you like the record or not, that does have that impact on somebody, on a collective memory is really, really important.
This film is a review of that album, the music the band made, and the world-conquering rock and roll stars who made it. Prior to releasing What's the Story, Oasis had already established themselves within the independent rock circuit, as well as achieving a remarkable degree of success with their hugely acclaimed 1994 debut, Definitely Maybe.
Oasis has just been one of them bands, and it's like every week it just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, so it was pretty obvious from the start that something special was happening, you know what I mean? Not particularly big, not solely because of the music they were making, but because of the lifestyle they were representing. They just tapped a nerve more so than any other band in the last 30 years has tapped, more than the Sex Pistols even, you know what I mean? Sex Pistols appealed to like a little minority of the population, and I was one of them at the time, but Oasis just like tapped into millions and millions and millions of people's tastes and attitudes.
I think Oasis just wanted to be the Stone Roses. They loved the Stone Roses. They absolutely adored the Stone Roses. Ian Brown in particular, for Liam. And I think that that's what they wanted to do, because when they were making Morning Glory, Stone Roses were labouring over their second album.
So you guys are originally from Manchester then, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's why you mentioned the Stone Roses, right?
Well, to me they were always the greatest band in England, but now they're the second greatest band in England.
Oh yeah, you being the first?
Absolutely, yeah.
And the general vibe was, Manchester is over. All the music press will say, Manchester's over. Nobody's going to come from Manchester ever again. You've had it, you played all your cars now. You've had the Roses, you've had the Mondays. Nothing's going to come through, which I think is a pretty stupid thing to say, because you never know what's going to come out of the city. There are no rules in pop music.
Noel came to a lot of our gigs in the early days, and when he heard that we needed a new singer, he put his name forward to audition, which I remember at the time thinking it was quite funny, because he didn't look like a front man, you know what I mean? He was like this little scally from Burnage. But yeah, we tried him out, we gave him an audition, and he could sing. I mean, he was a songwriter, he had songs that he was writing in his bedroom and stuff. But it just wasn't the sort of, he didn't have the vocal style that we needed. But we really liked him, you know, because we knew him a little bit through being a fan, and after this audition, you know, we kept in touch and basically just said to him, come and be a roadie if you want. Because we had no employees at the time, we had nobody working for us. None of us realised that we were looking at probably one of the most important songwriters, you know, of Britain in our lifetime, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I never looked at him and thought what a genius he is, you know what I mean? I always thought what a cool geezer is, what a top bloke, but never thought he was a musical genius or anything like that.
I saw him first at Kentish Town, I saw him at the Forum. And then they played the Astoria, they played then on the Tuesday and the Astoria on the Thursday. And afterwards they had this party and I got introduced to Noel, and he knew me because I'd been on the NME and I'd written about the Jam. And so from then, from 94 onwards, you know, to see this kind of, it was a phenomenon, an absolute phenomenon.
Oasis supported dodgy Manchester University before they had released anything. And there was no difference between them then than there is now. I remember spending a lot of time with Leo, sitting down chatting with him, and he was like, you know, There's only 2 bands in Manchester, the Roses and Oasis, and I was like, this is a guy that's not even got a record deal yet, you know, and he was that confident. And they were really good. They did their version of I Am the Walrus. So I played about 6 songs, and it was great. I thought they were brilliant then. I thought they were really great.
Definitely maybe had made a huge splash in the UK at a time when the idea of sort of an exciting British rock and roll band didn't sound terribly probable. I mean, this was coming straight out of the sort of a period in which the alternative sector in Britain had been dominated by you know, Seattle-based American grunge, and basically every band in Britain at that point was running around in kind of flannel shirts and stupid goatee beards and trying to sound like Soundgarden. And so Oasis sort of appeared in the middle of all this as with a really kind of fundamentalist subscription to all the great virtues of classic British rock and roll. All their influences were obviously British, the Beatles, Slade, the Kinks, and people were just reminded, I think, of, oh yeah, we can actually do it here as well.
It was the album that everybody had. Everyone had the Stone Roses album, and before that everyone had the Smiths albums. And then everybody bought Definitely Maybe. It was that album that kind of transcended the normal kind of indie, cool record buying fraternity and moved out into just everybody, you know, everybody you knew, people who didn't like music had that record.
When Columbia came out, that was something so sort of primal in that. That was such an amazing rock record, and still you listen to it now, and it's you know it gives you chills, that record. I mean, it's just, you know, it's so huge. It's everything that's great about British rock music, and you follow that with the likes of Supersonic and Shaker Maker and the album Definitely Maybe. I mean, it was, you know, it was sensational. I remember being extremely excited about it.
Rock music, hadn't seen a band like Oasis for years. I mean, you know, Oasis got me listening to rock music again because I didn't bother with it. It was just so tedious and boring. And then along comes this band, and you've got these amazing songs, and then you've got this front man who's so charismatic, and then you've got this, the look, you know, they look like a gang. They all look like they'd, you know, catch a bullet for each other. So there'd been nothing like it, you know, and then that debut album arrived. You know, the sound was huge. It was a unique sound. Liam's vocals, you hadn't heard a singer like that before. The whole package was just, you know, unbelievable. It just came and everything just fell in front of them, you know.
They looked great. They were terrific fun to write about. Their interviews were hilarious. So yeah, they were a phenomenon in the making, and I think the general perception was that the second album would be the one that, you know, cashed in on the promise.
Quite how Oasis were going to develop remained something of a mystery. After the initial burst of their vibrantly fresh and confident sound, there were numerous expectations as to how this would be followed.
The expectation was pretty great, and I suppose we were wondering what direction the songwriting would take, because the debut album was all about, we want to be rock and roll stars, we want to have fun, we want to get out of Burnage, and we want to be the biggest band in the world. Because that's what after Stone Roses, that's what new English bands were about. They were about, we want to be the biggest and the best. That was the simplicity of the message. You know, with the Smiths, the message was, I hate myself and I want to die, I want to go, you know, I hate being in public and having fun, and discotheques make me feel nauseous, I'm alienated, I'm a complex individual, I suffer. It was all about being, you know, a tortured individual. Oasis was the diametric opposite of that. It was all about communal pleasure and just the simple things in life, cigarettes and alcohol, and tonight I'm a rock and roll star.
Well, a lot of people do stand in front of the mirror with a tennis racket and mime along to songs. I used to do it when I was a kid. And for
for the duration of that record you'd mime into, whether it be like the Beatles or the Sex Pistols or whatever, you know, you are Johnny Rotten, you know, or you are John Lennon.
I'm not really sure that anybody was really expecting a massive progression from Definitely Maybe. I don't think anyone was imagining that Oasis were going to come back from their studio in Wales with a Sgt. Pepper for the 1990s. I think people realised that at heart Oasis were essentially a fairly, you know, meat and potatoes rock and roll band. They were a very good meat and potatoes rock and roll band, but that's what they were.
The first time I heard the album, like Morning Glory, I was in the studio next door. I was in Mono Valley, which is next door to Rockfield, producing this band called Cable. We just finished the recording. We went to town for a couple of drinks. And on the way back, this taxi stopped, and we got this taxi, and we just sat there, go blah, 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 chatting away. And there's kind of this bloke with two girls in the seat in front of us. He's kind of slumped down a bit. And we're chatting away, and he turns around and he goes, "Fucking hell, it's John Robb." And I go, "Oh, Christ, it's Liam, what are you doing here?" I didn't know they're in the studio. And he goes, "We're in Rockfield, we're just doing the album," you know, because when you're in the studio, you're just in your own little bubble. You don't even realise what's going on 500 yards up the road. And he says, "Come down, we're having a party." So we went down there, and he got the tape out of the studio, of the album. So we were the first people to ever hear the album, which is a bit of a buzz, you know. And they put it on, they played it, and I was going, this is pretty rocking, this. And he goes to the guy at Cable, Liam, he goes, "What do you think of this album?" He's dancing around and Liam, it's great, isn't it? And the bloke goes, "It's crap, it sounds like the Beatles." And Liam goes, "All right, fair play, you don't like it." And Liam's quite level, you know, he's quite cool about it. And then he plays another track, and he goes thinking that, he goes, "What's even crapper, it sounds like the Beatles." And the bloke was pissed out his head. And then he starts prodding Liam with his finger like that. And Liam's going, right, you can see Liam getting rattled, and I think, I'm just going to leave him to it. And then there's a massive crashing sound, and the fight kicks off, and they're having a fight in the other room. So I was dragging the guy from Cable away. I said, right, we're all going. Like, and Liam's going, right, you're all got to go. And Noel goes, right, that's it. About 4 in the morning, got in a car and drove to London and split the band up. So like, for 2 weeks, Oasis are completely split up. And it's all the fault of this bloke out of Cable. It's all a bit of a laugh, really, but we still heard about 8 of the tracks of the album.
Second albums are really difficult to make because with the first album, it's normally been songs that people in bands have been writing since they were at school. And then, you know, it might have been, they might have had 10 years worth of songs to draw upon. And that all goes into the first album, and it's all very young and exciting. Then they go off on tour and they become famous. And all of a sudden they've got to write a second album. And if you think about, you know, just bands like The Jam or The Clash, in their second albums were generally considered to be really weak.
It's the same with a lot of bands' second records that, you know, the story goes that the first record, you get 5 years to write it, and the second one you get about 6 months. So you can't expect them to come back with as equally strong songs. And so I think they did pretty well on that record.
I don't know what people expect from me. In fact, I couldn't be less interested, to be honest with you. You know, it's like I do it for me, first and foremost. I think once you start writing music for your audience, it's a bit... Why would you want to do that? I don't understand that, but if people like it and that's what they expected, then great. But I don't sit home and wonder what all the people out there are going to think of my next record or the one after that. I don't give a shit about that, you know.
Noel had kept on banging on in interviews about the fact he had, you know, drawers at home full of great songs that he could use to follow up Definitely Maybe, and I think everybody was quite sort of sceptical about that. But I guess that proved to be the case.
Regardless of the anticipation surrounding the release, it seemed that no one had any idea that Oasis was standing on the cusp of monumental success.
The success of Morning Glory took us all by surprise. Even though Oasis were obviously getting that much more successful, that much more quickly than a lot of other bands did. I mean, you know, the likes of Blur, who obviously they had their big spat with, it took them 2 or 3 albums to get to that sort of level that Oasis were at within the space of their first. So it was surprising. The singles were doing, you know, progressively better. Those signs that they were going to be the big band of the era were all in place. And but even then, we were just fairly shocked by the signs of the second record. We certainly found at the NME when What's the Story came out that they were a big band. They were a big band for us, certainly, a huge band in our world. But we hadn't quite cottoned on to how big they'd become in the real world, as it were, to the degree that when What's the Story came out, had made a big splash, but then a year later we were noticing it was still in the charts, and it was like still high up in the charts, and so we actually, I personally went down to the Virgin Megastore just to ask people who were buying it, you know, why are they still buying it? So I think that at that point they were really making that leap into the mainstream, really.
It sold nearly 4 million copies and counting in this country, which means as you sort of like walk down the street of any British city on any day, then you know, one person in 15 walking past you owns a copy of that record, which is a staggering level of influence to have.
They became these massive international rock and roll superstars, and they had all sorts of people at the gigs, and they mixed with the rich and famous, and I don't think they ever changed.
You don't get many people from Burnage achieving what they've achieved, do you really? You don't get many people from Manchester achieving that. It's pretty amazing stuff, really, what they've done. Really amazing.
On October 2nd, 1995, little over a year after the emergence of Definitely Maybe, What's the Story Morning Glory hit the shelves. With Oasis all set to introduce themselves to a much larger fan base, the record began with the rather appropriately titled Hello.
Hello is in every way an absolutely perfect opening track, and it really does set the tone for that album. Because, I mean, if you kind of think of how it tells the Oasis story, Definitely Maybe's the train robbery. It's the grand, ludicrous, how about this chap's scheme. What's the Story Morning Glory is the I can't believe we got away with it celebration.
I think Hello flattered to deceive, or it made you think you were going to get something that different. It was a little bit like a relic from the first album in a way. It was upbeat, and it was foot stomping, and it was anthemic, and it was a bit like Definitely Maybe Part 2, I think.
Oasis are good at sort of inane stompers, aren't they? You know what I mean? They're good at those. You know, it had that kind of Gary Glitter thing going on, which they're probably not too happy about now.
This was kind of like the Gary Glitter one, you know, the glitter band kind of glam stomp, and I think people thought, oh, okay, yeah, here we go. Is this going to be a bunch of recycled riffs, or is it going to be the greatest album? And you know, after that track, you know, I don't know, that track set people off thinking.
It's them saying hello to their 2 million fans, isn't it? It's like everyone's going, all the fans get the record, got to hope they haven't got all soft on us, I hope they've got dragged an orchestra out or got all weedy on us or something, and they put the album on, it's like, poof, this massive wall of sound. You can imagine every bedsit, every house, everybody in the country put that record on and go, yes, there's another kick-ass album.
Hello carried a direct lineage from the last album, most notably via the sound of every instrument turned up to their maximum volume, a technique known both as brick walling or sound walling, something which had been developed by producer Owen Morris.
A band like Oasis kind of need everything to be turned up full. I mean, that's what makes their music sound so huge, I guess. Sort of everything turn up to 11.
I think what people kind of forget is they were very, very psychedelic band. If you listen to Definitely Maybe and What's the Story, I mean, there's loads of feedback and there's loads of weird kind of noises, and there's the two guitar thing, some of that guitar is really, really distorted to the max. That can, you know, it's really nasty.
A real guitar player doesn't just plug in and put the amp on to 3 out of 10. I mean, that's pathetic doing that. You put it up to 10 and you keep trying to turn it around, you know. So it's just got this great empowering sound. It's like, It's fantastic. The first time I heard that, I thought, wow, this is great. This is absolutely great.
The sound overall on What's the Story, Morning Glory is really, really interesting because it does sound a lot different from Definitely Maybe, which did sound like a rock and roll band being recorded, but yet there is a sense that's been remarked upon often for Definitely Maybe that just this idea that people have of this mixing desk with just everything shoved all the way up to the top, which I don't think was entirely accidental. I think there's always been a certain symmetry about the fact that Oasis appeared on Creation Records because it did tend to get overlooked a lot at the time, but because when people talked about Oasis's influence, they correctly talked about the Beatles and Slade and the Kinks, but they missed a lot in terms of actually constructing the Oasis sound, the influence of quite obscure previous Creation bands like My Bloody Valentine and especially the House of Love, who really did trade in this enormous kind of backwash of electric guitar. And I'm sure that that incredible Magpie year of Noel Gallagher's picked up a few tricks from them as well.
The bombastic introduction of Hello was followed up by one of the band's most infamous yet widely derided singles, Roll With It.
A lot of people criticise Roll With It, and it's not like looked on as one of the classics on the album. It's actually a pretty good song. It's Oasis by numbers, but even Oasis by numbers is good.
Roll With It is an absolutely terrible song, truly atrocious. It is status quo. I mean, there's nothing else to say about it. I mean, without actually wanting to rip off status quo, they have done exactly that. They've just done a status quo song.
Noel Gallagher has famously described Roll With It as, in one word, appalling, and that's a little bit harsh. It's fairly mindless, but it's not without its appeal. I think there's quite the melody of the chorus is quite pretty. The guitars there's quite an interesting guitar part in there if you want to go looking for it. It's harmless, I think, would be the best way to characterise it, but I don't think it's what... It's not going to be the title that Noel Gallagher wants chiselled on his tombstone.
Roll With It also marked Oasis's entry into a now legendary chart battle, the heated contest for the #1 slot with their supposed arch-rivals, Blur.
Everyone says this, but, in the 60s you had the Stones versus the Beatles, and in the early 70s you had T-Rex versus Slade, apparently moving release dates to avoid each other so that there'd be no competition. And in the 80s you had Spandau versus Duran, and this was just another version of that. And whether it was a contrived attempt to generate publicity or not, doesn't matter, because the effect was achieved, and it was a great pop moment.
The Manchester band Oasis and their arch-rivals Blur released new singles today, each hoping to reach the #1 spot next week. The music industry hasn't seen anything like it since the Beatles fought it out with the Rolling Stones in the 60s.
Whenever anybody talks about the Oasis story, they'll talk about the Blur thing and the Oasis thing, which wasn't really about two bands, it was probably more about two record companies. And they both sold loads more singles as a result of that whole shenanigan. But if you had to ask me to choose between them, I'd always go for Oasis.
Oasis made it very easy for the media to pick up on, and Blur also, with that sort of rivalry.
I'd like to thank all the people. All the people. So many people. And they walk your hands in hands through their shite life.
You know that if you met Oasis and Blur, you'd probably get on. I personally think that I'd get on with Oasis better. That was always my thing. I mean, I've done gigs with Blur, and I've never met them. I've done gigs with Oasis and met them. Do you know what I mean? It's just simple. It's just simple, and it's not a north-south thing. It's just like, working class thing.
This is a radio moment. Probably the two largest bands in England right now together in one radio studio.
In one ring, man.
That's right.
I'm wearing the blue shorts.
Are they coming in? Come on in.
Wearing the white shorts, Blur.
That's right. Oasis in the red shorts.
8 stone, 3 pounds. Bands are all overweight.
Oh, man, this is crazy.
Music's meant to kind of bring people together, really, not sort of divide them up. So yeah, but they sold a hell of a lot of records because of it. And I think they both kind of, as bands, they were all intelligent people and realised that this was going to just sort of do wonders for them, because it was turning what they were doing into the same kind of rivalries that the Beatles and the Stones had, or the Jam and the Clash had.
Roll With It, of course, became a bigger deal than it deserved to be, because it was the force Oasis deployed in their epic battle with Blur in August 1995, when the two bands went head-to-head by releasing singles on the same date. And there is, of course, the irony that in both cases, both bands released arguably the worst thing they'd ever recorded. Oasis with Roll With It, Blur with Country House. And as it was, of course, it can be said that while Blur won that particular battle, Oasis eventually won the war.
He's got morning glory and life's a different story. Everything's going Jack and Jory. In touch with his own mortality. He's reading Paul's and looking back closer. It's a helping hand that makes you...
I thought that kind of rivalry was a shame, because it kind of, had all those class divisions behind it. I think that Oasis was seen as a kind of the lads band, the sort of, proletariat band, for want of a better word, and Blur were more the kind of art school, indie kind of people.
I think a lot of their popularity came from the fact that people could relate to them. They were just your mate being really cool on stage. But once they got so huge, that kind of meant that, to a large degree, their audience became quite horrible. I mean, their audience, when you got to the likes of Nebworth or Finsbury Park, where I saw them about 5 or 6 years ago, became, the football fan, drunk at 2 o'clock, vomiting on their shoes at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They became the sort of the lads band, which, I mean, all very real and that, but doesn't make for that pleasant an experience, especially when you're in a 90,000 seater arena with them.
Seem all like you always get these gigs where there'll be the front 3 rows of people in this big massive hole, where there's just geezers running around punching each other during like Live Forever and stuff, and it's like totally missing the point.
There is a certain element of people in the music press, especially at the Melody Maker at the time, which are quite snooty about bands that came from the north. People say, oh, they just look like a bunch of plumbers, and they're just thick northerners. And I was at the Melody Maker at the time, and you would hear people saying that. Certain people like that paper would have this kind of snobbish attitude, which I think is utterly ridiculous when you write about music, because it doesn't really matter. I don't care if Prince Charles makes a great record, it's a great record. I mean, he's not likely to, is he? But he might be, It doesn't matter who the people are. If the record's great, let's have it, And that's the thing about Oasis. It was proof that anybody, with a bit of application, can make a great record. Well, of course, you have to have a brilliant songwriter as well, which helps.
For many, the Blur-Oasis face-off marked the culmination of the Britpop movement, a cultural scene as distinctive as anything that had developed since the 1960s.
The term Britpop was invented by a journalist. And the reason that journalists or newspapers love movements is that it sells them papers. And especially if they're the first newspaper to be perceived to support that particular movement. So this lesson was learnt when punk happened. And the NME went from 100,000 sales a week to 250, it's 250,000 basically, because it was perceived as being the best and the most enthusiastic supporter of punk. And its kind of offshoots like New Wave. But then if you look at the NMEs from about 78 onwards, and Melody Makers, everybody's scrambling for the new, the new thing. So therefore in '94, when the word Britpop was invented, it had a lot of connotations which Oasis were associated with.
It was like any kind of identifiable musical movement. At the heart of it, there were 2 or 3 really interesting and enduringly great bands, and And Britpop did produce some fantastic records by Oasis, by Blur, by Pulp in particular, which really do stand up and which you can still imagine, you know, sane people wanting to listen to. But invariably, these are kind of pursued by an enormous throng of, you know, bandwagon jumpers, ambulance chasers, you know, chancers and frauds. And there was a period at which Camden was just overrun by sort of, you know, idiots in skinny ties and stupid suits and funny haircuts, and if you're one of those people at that point and you could hold a guitar the right way up, then yeah, you'd get signed the same way that you would have if you'd been in Seattle 3 years earlier with a goatee beard and a checked shirt. So like any identifiable movement, once you kind of like sorted out the chaff, you know, yeah, there was some there was some exciting stuff at the heart of it, absolutely.
You tend to find with pretty much every scene that as soon as a band or a record comes along that becomes absolutely huge and crosses over to the mass record buying public at large, that will tend to kill the scene, which is what we had with What's the Story. I mean, once you get those massive great records, suddenly all the record company wants is that record again, and they want new bands that sound like that. So Britpop became this really dull scene, essentially, or what we call post-Britpop, I guess, once you hit sort of 95, 96, where it's all sort of, you know, stodgy bands with guitars who've got an acoustic segment in their shows, you know, doing this sort of arena-sized rock, or supposedly alternative rock. You know, there were so many bands, and those were the ones that the record companies were chasing, and those were the ones that the people who had bought What's the Story wanted.
That's kind of an interesting theory that Oasis never got beyond Britpop, but I think they were very different. They were different bands. I think sort of Oasis were like some great big sort of oil tanker or something. I mean, to get them off their course was always going to be a kind of big effort. Where Blur had a very quick turnover of ideas and styles, and Oasis kind of, it's that great thing that some great artists have, like, you know, Steve McQueen or Albert Finney or something. It's like they know what they're good at and they stick to it.
Swiftly cementing itself as the sound of the era, it was the third song from What's the Story, also a single, that incredibly managed to make Oasis even bigger.
Up until then, it'd been mainly rock and roll singles. You know, there'd been Live Forever and Supersonic and Shake and Make and Roll With It, and these were all up-tempo, in-your-face, snarling, sneering, arrogant rock and roll. And then suddenly here was Wonderwall, and it was like the Christmas single, and, you know, everybody just, you know, mums loved it, dads liked it, you know, the kids adored it. You couldn't, you know, ask for more than that. That really broke Oasis.
I remember when I first heard Wonderwall, and I'd just come back from being away touring, and I heard it, and I thought, God, that sounds like a demo. It sounded like a demo. It was like acoustic, brushes, drums. But, you know, you can't mistake the appeal of the song.
It's one of the great love songs. I think Noel has this ability of kind of writing these sort of lines that people can sing to each other, like couples can sort of sing to each other, which kind of say more than those two people could ever probably express themselves, and just in one line, you know. There are many things that I would like to say to you, but I don't know how. I mean, that's poetry.
Obviously, a great many people have an enormous soft spot for Wonderwall. I am not one of them. I think it's an absolutely atrocious song. I think it's sappy, it's sentimental, it's mawkish, and it sounds like something that was written for sort of like drunk men in tracksuits to yell through their letterboxes at their wives who've thrown them out, and with good reason.
Wonderwall reminds me of when alternative rock music really became everyone's property. So I feel sad about that. I'm also fed up of hearing it, blaring out of pub jukeboxes. And it's got too many associations with kind of chavvy council estate girls on the Raz. You know, it's got too many ugly associations for me. It's not a private pleasure for me, that song.
The tune is a non-event. I think Liam sings it incredibly badly. I think he's a fantastic singer on sort of upbeat rock songs. He's a fantastic rock vocalist, but a lot of the time when he tries to do ballads, he doesn't have that kind of vulnerability or tremble that someone like Mick Jagger would have had on, say, something like Angie or Wild Horses. And I think Liam honks his way through it fairly excruciatingly, I have to say.
If I can sing it, he can sing it, apart from the quieter ones. Like some of the acoustic ones, he's got a very loud voice, so he couldn't really be able to sing sad songs and stuff like that. So I sing them. But I don't write with him in mind at all. I just write.
I think he's got that ability to kind of express what ordinary people think and say. Sometimes sort of ordinary, you know, people don't like talking about their emotions unless they're drunk down the pub or whatever. And I think that's all. And Liam's voice is a bit like that. Everything's just slightly below the surface. All the emotion is slightly below the surface, which makes it really, really kind of, nice to listen to.
Liam's got, he's got an amazing voice, a great rock voice, and that sort of that growl he puts on in the rock songs is, it's legendary now. It's absolutely classic. But yeah, it does tend to feel slightly bland in the ballads.
I think Liam is the archetypal rock and roll star, isn't he? You know, that's brilliant, just walking up to the microphone, this is me, these are my songs. You can't beat that, can you?
Wonderwall quickly became part of the national psyche, leading many to ask the same question. Had Oasis achieved all this simply by being in the right place at the right time?
You see, the thing is, people say that Oasis got lucky. Oh, they were in the right place at the right time. But you can't be in the right place at the right time and have the right stuff. They had everything, didn't they? You can't be that lucky. They were obviously, of the moment, they were honest and real, and I think that's why people bought into them.
They were, the everyman. And so they came along with a big, stonking great rock record, which was brilliant. And they encapsulated a Britishness that wasn't otherwise being encapsulated. So I don't think it was the time, particularly. I don't think it was Britpop that helped them along. I think what they did is they came along with a brilliant record and just said, Britpop, yeah, we'll have that. But I think that would have happened at any time they'd come out with it.
For any band to break the place open as spectacularly as Oasis did, a lot of it is just down to dumb luck, the planets lining up the right way, being the right band in the right place at the right time, and they absolutely were. To an extent as well, you make your own luck. They put themselves there. Noel Gallagher, the man at the heart of Oasis, is a very canny human being and a very sharp operator, which isn't to say I think there was anything particularly contrived or cynical about what they were doing, but I think when Definitely Maybe became such a success, they did understand that, okay, we really can go the rest of the way here, and they did.
Wonderwall's colossal sing-along status seemed almost unbeatable until Oasis released the final single from the album, track number 4, Don't Look Back in Anger.
I think Don't Look Back in Anger is a classic, absolute classic. Play it today, fantastic tune. Really, really beautiful. Wonderwall's okay, but Wonderwall was one of those songs which, it kind of, after a while, it just got too big. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, it was just like you heard it all the time, and you can hear a record too much sometimes, you know what I mean? Sometimes then you hear it 1 year later, you think, oh, actually, that's a really good tune, that, but it was. I much prefer Don't Look Back in Anger. I thought that was a fantastic tune.
I think it's the strongest song on the album. Don't Look Back in Anger is everything you want from an Oasis song. It's quite. I mean, yes, it's a bit more restrained, but it's still got that big anthemic feel that all the great Oasis songs have.
Some of these really, really great big songs, even like Imagine, there's a side of them where you think, well, it's kind of, is it, overly simple? But I mean, You know, it's not. It's very tender. And Noel's voice, you know, Noel gets away with singing that, and it's odd because I was thinking the other day about, you know, favourite Oasis songs. I thought ones that are particularly kind of moving. And I thought of, you know, Look Back in Anger, and I thought of Half a World Away, and then Talk Tonight. And then there's a song on Standing on the Shoulder of Giants, Where Did It All Go Wrong? And I suddenly thought, God, what have they all got in common? It's like, what they've all got in common is Noel sings them. So he obviously brought, I think he had a particular kind of, especially on the more acoustic numbers and the kind of the slower, very Beatlesy melodic numbers. His voice worked kind of really well, you know, in the way that Paul McCartney's did on those kind of songs with the Beatles. I think it's kind of very interesting that he chose to sing those songs as well, because it obviously meant they were kind of meant something very special to him.
Well, I think it's quite telling that that the best sounding ballad on the record is the one Noel sings.
Don't Look Back in Anger, I think, actually works a little bit better for Noel, quite wisely, having taken vocal duties off his younger brother for that one. It's incredibly bombastic and incredibly full of itself.
Don't Look Back in Anger, I think, is one of the last truly brilliant songs that they did. That was probably the pinnacle of their sort of mass popularity, as far as, you know, if every band has one or two songs that go down in history.
Despite its popularity, Don't Look Back in Anger gave many the notion that songwriter Noel Gallagher had plagiarised heavily from John Lennon's Imagine. This was, however, merely the latest in a string of similar accusations that had dogged Oasis since the beginning of their career.
You know, having Imagine at the beginning of Don't Look Back in Anger, it's more of a reference than a rip-off. It doesn't actually make the song. It doesn't actually even fit in the song. In fact, I don't think there's actually much point in having it there at all, because it doesn't really say much for the song. But on the other hand, it's a reference point to a song that they obviously really love. I mean, to me, it's the most hokey song John Lennon ever wrote. It's corny, isn't it? But to put it at the beginning of the song, it's almost like a reference point to say, but you know, they're going like that to John Lennon, aren't they? You know.
John Lennon used to fucking moon about doing little mad things and
Do
that.
you know John Lennon?
Do you know him?
I don't, but do you?
Yeah.
Well, you must be pretty old. How old are you? 21?
No. About fucking 1005 fucking one.
You're 22?
No, I'm 21.
Right, and remember, I watched you being born.
Right then.
And I don't even know John Lennon.
Right then.
So shut the fuck up about knowing John Lennon.
The number of headlines along the lines of the great tune robbery that Oasis have put up with over the years are not entirely unjustified. By the time Morning Glory came out, he'd already been sued successfully by Neil Innes over Whatever, which he thought was too close to his spoof song, How Sweet to Be an Idiot.
How sweet to be an idiot, as harmless as a cloud. I'm free to be whatever I choose, and I'll sing the blues if I want. I'm free.
The ironies that piled up there, given that Neil Innes was most successful for making the film The Ruttles about a spoof version of the Beatles, then suing Noel Gallagher, who a lot of people thought was essentially, you know, running his own spoof version of the Beatles by that point. And Noel Gallagher had also been sued by the New Seekers because the chorus of Shaker Maker was a complete steal from I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing, and a song called Step Up was going to be on What's the Story, Morning Glory, but was pulled because Stevie Wonder's publishers wanted too much money for it, because the melody was lifted wholesale from Uptight, which you have to say was a fairly Pyrrhic victory for Stevie Wonder's publishers, because if I'd written a melody that Noel Gallagher wanted to steal and put on a record that was going to sell 18 million copies, then he's welcome.
All rock and roll music is derivative, and the accusation that gets levelled at Oasis that they just Beatles copy it. All music is like that. You know, you can hear influences, and it's homage, isn't it, in the end?
To plagiarise something I'm not really a massive fan of. I think rock music can move on. I think we're in 2006 now, and I think there are a few rock bands that have taken it a bit further.
Noel Gallagher has always been absolutely unashamed about his borrowing of old rock records. He almost, you know, he just goes like that. He flaunts it. You know, he does that with people that might even dare to suggest that you can't do that. Well, you can, and he has, and he will again.
Has Noel Gallagher ever nicked anything musically from us? I don't know. I mean, he's probably borrowed bits, you know what I mean? And I don't expect he's going to give them back. No, he's only as guilty of plagiarism as any of us are, you know what I mean? That's what it's all about, really, isn't it? Taking other people's ideas and reshaping them a bit.
The success of Wonderwall and Don't Look Back in Anger inevitably meant that they overshadowed some of the other songs on the record, such as the track that follows them, Hey Now.
Hey Now is largely unremembered with good reason. I mean, it sounded pretty rocking live, but in the context of the album, it is an absolute filler, and actually what it also is, as it turned out, was rather a harbinger of what much of the rest of Oasis's career would sound like. It sounds like Oasis, but not as good.
Obviously they had some tracks on it, like Hey Now, which are kind of less memorable. Which you can't say about Definitely Maybe, to be honest with you.
I mean, all classic albums, including Pet Sounds, you know, Sgt. Pepper, they've all got their 1 or 2 Duff tracks, and What's the Story's got its fair share of Duff tracks. But I think the 3 or 4 obvious standout tracks give the sense, more than it deserves, that this is a great unified concept of an album.
With a record like What's the Story, Morning Glory, it's almost impossible to have anything on there that's underrated, because a record that big has been torn to pieces and appreciated over and over again, and so I don't think there's any tracks on that you could call underrated.
If you're the next track after Don't Look Back in Anger, you are going to get forgotten. You know, there's no way around it. But they're really good songs, and also they make the album really work, because you've heard the singles so many times. It's actually great to hear something with a slightly different twist to it. You think, oh God, I forgot about this one. This is really good.
Another lesser remembered aspect of the album are the instrumental moments. Quick musical snapshots that occasionally emerge between tracks.
They were prey to artistic pretensions, and I think that's what's going on there. That's a sort of attempt to try and sound... I think it's the kind of thing they thought that's the sort of thing the Beatles might have done, so let's do that.
I think he got that idea from Weller, because Paul used to do that on his solo albums, like on the first 2 especially.
Quite what purpose or point those things are supposed to serve, I have absolutely no idea. They don't do any harm, but it's a curiously pretentious quirk from such an avowedly sort of no-nonsense rock and roll band.
One of these musical snippets was taken from their B-side, The Swamp Song, a knowing nod perhaps to the sheer quality of the additional tracks that Noel Gallagher was including on the band's single releases.
I think that was kind of almost unique in the 90s with Oasis, that they put songs that could be A-sides or brilliant album tracks on B-sides.
At this point in time, this is a band completely in its pomp. Noel could have B-sides, which are far better than most songs any band ever writes in its career. They're just chucked away in a B-side, you know. And a lot of the B-sides that Acquiesce are absolute classic songs. You know, they're like some of the best songs in the Oasis canon. It's crazy to believe that was never an A-side song. You know, that's one of the songs that absolutely takes the stadium apart when you see them play it live.
Well, Oasis are one of those bands that their fans will soak up absolutely everything they put out. So B-sides were very, very important to the fans buying the records. So I don't think there's any surprise that when they played the likes of Acquiesce live, the place goes crazy.
By this time I was hanging out with Noel a lot, because me and him got on really well, because we had football, music, Catholicism and council houses in sort of common, you know. And, you know, he'd play me you know, some song and he'd go, oh yeah, but I'm saving that for the 4th album. He was just on it all the time. He was just, you know, you'd go to a sound check, he'd always have a new song. He was always trying. I think it was a really golden period for him, that. I think he had a lot of support, and he had a lot of, you know, all his ideas were going to get realised in a really good manner, you know. I mean, you know, to put the master plan on a B-side, ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, when I first heard that, I was like, that's just, you know, it's another classic song.
It's called the master plan.
Those B-sides, you know, things like Step Up, things like the Master Plan and Acquiesce that were all generated around the time this album was recorded, any of those would have more than earned their place on the album. I mean, he was absolutely on a roll as a songwriter at this point, and I think a big part of that, I think when that happens, it's usually driven by two things. One is staggering confidence of just thinking, I've done it, I got away with it, everybody loves my band, I can do anything. And I think the other thing as well was possibly a feeling of thinking, how long is this going to last? Because this is the other great terror that lurks inside anybody who does actually crack it, is this all going to be over this time next year? We'd better cash in while we can. And I think he had no compunction at the time about thinking, let's just bash this stuff out now, let's get it all out there. There may not be any point. If I've got another great song, there may not be any point in saving it for the 3rd album. As it turned out, of course, everybody ended up with rather good reason to wish he had saved a few more of these songs for the 3rd album.
The album drifts back into familiarity with the 7th track. Some might say it was the first single to be released from the record, and also marked Oasis's first UK #1.
I think it's a great song, and the reason it's a great song is the harmonies. When Nolan and Liam harmonise on that, I don't know, it does something. It sends a chill up your spine. I think it's great bit of, again, like very underrated or overlooked sort of bit of what made them great musically was those two kind of voices sort of blending together, which they seem to do really kind of effortlessly.
As you know, the first song we heard from the record, it kind of introduced that you know, mid-tempo Oasis sound. It kind of sums up the Oasis sound they've stuck with now for many years. But on first listen, it did seem slightly different. It sounded slightly bigger than the stuff off of Definitely Maybe. Kind of a bit less cool, to be honest. I thought a bit more sort of standard British rock. But you know, it was a good tune, and it kind of, you know, it set standards. I mean, I tend to find that before each of the singles that the band have released before each of their albums have kind of set the standard of how good that record's going to be. So you've got, you know, Supersonic, fantastic record, pre-cooling, Definitely Maybe, a fantastic record. Some might say a pretty good single coming out before What's the Story, you know, a pretty good record. And then it was like, do you know what I mean? The dullest record on earth coming out before Be Here Now. I mean, and by that point, once Do You Know What I Mean came out, you just knew that was it. It was all over, really. They were never going to come out with another, you know, mind-blowingly fresh sound.
It's that thing of, like, you know, when you're a songwriter, you look for hooks. You're looking for hooks, and, like, you know, his mum probably said that to him. Well, you know, some might say that, you know, and, you know, it's like that's pop. It's like hooks are nothing. Hooks are like sort of, they're very hard to find, but they're there all the time. And some might say it's a perfect example of that.
I think some might say it's brilliant, actually. I think that's a fantastic #1 single, and that really was much more than Roll With It was, I think everyone knows that was a throwaway. Almost a novelty, knees up, umpar, kind of playing to the sort of the idea that they were the Britpop quo. Some might say was far cleverer than that, and that was a great moment actually. That being massive gave everybody a thrill. That was really fantastic.
In the 90s, we started to enter a period where the charts are getting less and less important. But Oasis records still were really, but they did feel like events when they came out. I don't know whether in the whole world, the whole of the UK was a massive event, but it felt like an event, definitely in the music scene, and definitely around Manchester. There's a feeling of excitement. And there's also, you would look at the charts and you're kind of hoping you'd get to number one. I don't know why. Why should I care if it gets to number one? It's not like I'm getting any money out of it. But it's a kind of feeling of pride. You think, go on, Noel, it's great, you know.
In the mid-90s, the charts were possibly just at the top of the decline that they have spiralled into since. I mean, for example, the battle for number one between Blur and Oasis was the last time I can recall anybody really caring.
I could make a record, sell 30 copies, I'd be number one next week. It's ridiculous now, you know.
That's great when you're number one, isn't it? That would be demeaning to all the bands who've never had one, you know what I mean? It's easy when you're really cool and, you know, an underground band to say, oh, it doesn't matter. But it does. If you're going to be in the charts, you might as well be top. You know, there's nothing more annoying than being number two in the charts, believe you me.
Yeah, at the time, yeah, it seemed like a big deal that Oasis had a number one, but really, pretty much now anybody with competent distribution, a large family, and, you know, the sort of willingness to put the hours in to organise it can have at least a top 40 hit. It's not difficult anymore, and it doesn't really matter.
While some might say it was a bombastic assault on the ears, the next track on Morning Glory, Cast No Shadow, marked a return to more ballad-driven territory.
Actually, for me, Cast No Shadow is a better song than Wonderwall. It's a really, really great song, isn't it? I think a lot of people really recognise it's been a really great song. Again, it shows there's more size to Oasis than people think. You know, it's not a completely yobbish, dumb band, or just it's all about swagger and rock and roll, and we're getting to the top, and isn't it great, Manchester? There's actually like another side to him, you know, sitting there with the acoustic guitar, looking at the floor, feeling a bit down, you know, and they capture that really perfectly in Cast No Shadow.
Again, another dimension to it. I mean, what do you write about if you're a band? Do you write about, well, you know, what you did before you were in a band, and then what you write about girls and relationships or whatever, and then it's kind of what other sort of stuff do you write about? And I think I was writing about a kind of close friend, you know, who they kind of really admired, and or it certainly seems that way, and yeah, it's nice. It just adds another kind of twist to the album.
It's just, I think, one of the 4 or 5 songs on that album that really give it its mood, and, you know, the sense of longing almost for the life that Noel Gallagher was leading before he became a rock and roll superstar, which was weird because that's all he ever wanted.
I think maybe Cast No Shadow doesn't get the recognition it deserves, but, you know, it gets much more recognition than a lot of amazing songs by other bands.
Cast No Shadow, I think, yeah, Liam rather brays it rather than sings it. It's dedicated on the sleeve notes to the genius of Richard Ashcroft, which I would have called a fairly debatable proposition myself, but that's a nice idea for a song. It's a generous tribute, although Noel Gallagher's lyrics being as you know, vague and non-specific as they are, it really could just as easily be about, you know, Diego Maradona or Leon Trotsky or nobody or nothing at all, really.
This dedication was an uncharacteristic nod towards one of their peers. Richard Ashcroft, a longtime friend of the Gallaghers, was lead singer of fellow northern collective The Verve, who, until they imploded in 1998, was seen by many as being all set to enjoy the same level of success as Oasis.
See, Verve actually go back to the Stone Roses. They come from that tradition. That's the model, isn't it? They, you know, Stone Roses did what they had to do and left, and maybe Verve think in those kind of terms, whereas Oasis will bludgeon on, you know, they're a band that don't make their art statement and go. I mean, Oasis is about keeping them going.
It's not a job. Not something I could just say, in fact, I don't want to be in a band anymore. You know. I can't not, because this is my life. This is what I do. This is what I was doing 10 years before you even knew who I was.
I don't think the Verve were ever in any meaningful danger of becoming anything like as big as Oasis. I think they were, to a colossal extent, a massive confidence trick who got incredibly lucky on one song, the good bits of which weren't theirs.
No change, I can change, I can change, I can change, but I'm here in my mode, I am here in my mode.
Beyond that, I think there was very, very little holding the Verve edifice up, and as I think has certainly been borne out by Richard Ashcroft's solo works, the lyrics of which, I have to say, make Noel Gallagher read like T.S. Eliot.
Yet another change in direction is evident in the next track, the light-hearted and often derided She's Electric.
She's electric, she's in a family full of eccentrics, she's done things I've never expected.
It seemed, even though this was only the second album, that every Oasis album was going to have a comedy moment on it. And on the first album it was Digsy's Dinner, and on the second album it was She's Electric. And I think She's Electric has quite a jolting effect. It really has a jarring relationship with these sort of the quite beautiful, downbeat, mournful ballads that comprise most of the album. And it's like someone doing, Knees Up Mother Brown in the middle of a funeral.
I like throwaway songs. I think it's great you get a wacky song on. The Beatles always did it. Yellow Submarine, which I've always really loved, but maybe it's because I remember when I was a kid, and when I was 7, it's the first pop song I ever really got into was Yellow Submarine. And you listen to it now years later and you think, it's actually quite psychedelic. It's quite a weird song, isn't it? You can listen to it as a kid's song. It's great. It works as a kid's song. It's like a nursery rhyme. A lot of great pop music is nursery rhymes.
Lyrically, I think Noel Gallagher did get rumbled for having nicked quite a lot of it from the Theme to the Schools programme. There's sort of lots for us to see, which, I mean, it does sound like something somebody wearing a clown suit should be singing to an audience of sort of bewildered 5-year-olds.
No, I mean, Noel's lyrics are kind of really interesting because some of it is kind of doggerel. It's kind of what, if you've had a couple of bottles of red wine, you might kind of blurt out with things that rhyme, and then you could kind of justify it by saying it's psychedelic, it's weird, it's a stream of consciousness, sort of mishmash of ideas.
It sort of starts off with the music and then it'll change halfway through, like writing a melody over the words always come last, but the melody and the actual chords on the guitar come first.
Noel's never been that. He's never been known for his Wildian ironies in his lyrics, has he? I mean, he's no Morrissey, let's face it. And I kind of think there's a bit of a charm to the nonsense lyrics. Certainly, when Supersonic came out and I was sort of dancing around the indie discos to it, it seemed, a little bit sort of magical and dangerous, sniffing stuff through a cane on a supersonic train. It's just like, what's he mean? It sounds like, wow, what drugs is this fella on? But once you get to the trite stuff like rhyming sister with blister, I mean, that's just like, obviously 5 o'clock in the morning, sister, blister, brilliant, yeah, that'll do. When we're recording this, 10 minutes, right, okay.
I think his lyrics are, okay on it, I think there's far worse things later on down the line. I mean, where he's obviously kind of struggling for things to write about. Because he wakes up and he just sees an acre of garden and a swimming pool and some beautiful trees and a football pitch, Though pitch would rhyme with ditch, pool would rhyme with fool, trees would rhyme with knees or bees, and the house would belong to a very tiny mouse.
Possibly this was why, famously after his election in 1997, Tony Blair perceived a certain kindred spirit in Noel Gallagher. I mean, both of them were very good at sort of writing things that when you heard them in context, or saw them perform, just sounded amazing. And then when you actually read them written down on paper, you just thought, what the hell is this all about? And plus, of course, some might say does mention education.
There are 7 people in this room tonight who are giving a little bit of hope to young people in this country. That is me, our kid, Bonehead, Quigsy, Alan White, Alan McGee and Tony Blair. And if you've all got anything about you, you get up there and you shake Tony Blair's hand, man. He's a man. Power to the people!
While She's Electric was heavily reliant on humour and irony, the next song, title track Morning Glory, saw the music and lyrics taking a much darker turn.
All your dreams are made when you change to the mirror and a razor blade. Today's the day that all the world will see.
I think that's a really exciting rock and roll song that's almost worthy of, you know, the Stones or the Stooges. You know, and I can think of no higher compliment. I think that's brilliant. And that's where Noel Gallagher's, you know, hazy, mixed up images somehow seems to work.
The title track is Oasis sort of, I think, staking their claim on, yes, we are, you know, rock and roll colossi, look upon our works ye mighty in despair.
Morning Glory is the one I love by R.E.M. And you know, numerous other little steals from lots of other different things.
There's elements of The One I Love by R.E.M. in it, but The One I Love has got a great tune, and this one is just like, there's done nothing to it, really. I mean, it kind of just rockets along and then stops, and it's so long, it's like 5 minutes long or something stupid. I mean, you know, there's not enough song to fill it. So yeah, so it's the noise, and it's them sort of, you know, it's taking the noise element to its extreme, and fairly pointlessly, I think. I think that's one of the low points of the record.
It's actually my least favourite track on the album, because I've never been that bothered about R.E.M. And yeah, it's good, but it's not. It doesn't have the come from that tradition of great stomping anthems or very introspective kind of Britishness, which the rest of the album is very good at.
The more Americanized sound of Morning Glory meant that the song was released as a single for the US market, part of the band's much vaunted attempt to become equally as huge on the other side of the Atlantic.
I don't know if Oasis could ever have made it in America. When you think about British bands that have made it in America in the last 20 years, Radiohead and Coldplay and the Cranberries. I don't know if Americans would ever have taken to bolshy British boot boys, working class. You know, they've got their own working class poets, if you like. They've got their Bruce Springsteens and their John Cougar Mellencamp's that speak about what it's like to live in America's heartland and work in factories and dream of escape. Oasis are the British version of that.
I don't think the Americans ever really got Oasis, and that's because they saw them as a rock band, and they're more than a rock band, really. It's like if the Beatles came along, you know, today, would they break America? And it's like, well, they probably wouldn't. I don't know if it's so kind of segregated musically, and rock stations playing sort of rock music. I don't think they could have released the same kind of singles that they released in Britain.
They want bands to be a bit humble, and you know, they know how big they are in America, and you know, you can't just go over and be snotty and take the place. I mean, you know, I don't think that's ever worked for anybody.
I'll tell you what, man, I've never seen a band try so hard to break America. I mean, they work their asses off. You know, most English bands go to America, they go New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, home. Oasis went New York, that bit in between, that bit in between, that bit in there, down to Texas. I mean, they really, you know, they really hammered it in America. I think it was very important for them to compete with all the other American bands. And they really kind of went at it hammer and tongs, you know. I went on tour with them around America, and it was, you know, 2,000 seaters in, you know, Baxwellville, Nowheresville, you know, that place, you know.
Live 105, hello?
Hello, I got something to say to Oasis. Hello? You guys are playing in like a 21 and over club?
Yeah, we are. We're playing at Midland Club in Old St. Cagaff.
No, I'm 18. You're bastards, you know?
Oh, the 21 Club, yeah? Oh,
yeah,
it's not my
I can't
fault.
see you.
You want to ring, what's he called, President Clinton?
See, that's the myth about Oasis, isn't it? Oh yeah, Oasis, they never made it in America, but they had a top 10 album. This was a top 10 album and a top 5 single. In a period, hardly any British bands ever get a top 10 album, you know. And even now, years later, they still sell out the Madison Square Gardens in 17 minutes, was it, something like amazing? You know, that's not bad, is it? I mean, most British bands go there, they can't sell out CBGBs in 17 minutes.
Morning Glory, as with many Oasis songs, also featured references to drugs culture, a frank honesty about their bad boy image that caused the band no small amount of controversy.
Noel was always a party animal, and even when he came to us at the beginning, it was like, he liked to party, you know what I mean? He was always off to raves at the weekend and all that. He used to have raves in fields in those days, and he was always off to these things. And as the Inspirals became more and more successful, and as Noel's wage became bigger and bigger, yeah, he used to indulge himself in a few of his favourite things.
You know, in the 80s, drugs, few people took drugs, didn't they? It wasn't like mainstream. Acid house comes along, a lot of people get into ecstasy, suddenly drugs are everywhere, you know. There's people taking drugs all over the city centre. You think, God, these people are actually all on drugs. It was, you know, when I was a kid, there's only a few people who took drugs. It was something that kind of mad people who, like chemists, would be into drugs, you know, or, you know, and a couple of freaks at school would take drugs. But then suddenly, I'm sure if I went back to school I went to now, there'd be 5 people who didn't take drugs and everyone else would.
If you like a rock and roll band, you want to know that they've trashed a hotel room, don't you? You don't want to know that they go home and have yogurt. You want to think that they live in this life. That's why you buy their records, so you can live your fantasies through them. You want them to be debauched and deranged and dangerous. You know, that's what you want. You don't want your rock and roll stars doing yoga and thinking about calling the kids Apple or something like that. You want them to be having a good time.
That sort of got away from the music. When I went to see them at Glastonbury in '94, I think it was '94, they argued on stage, and it was just like, that's not what you want to hear at Glastonbury. A couple of blokes having an argument, because, you know, it's Glastonbury, and so that was quite difficult. I just wanted them to play their music and just let everyone, you know, immerse themselves in their music, really.
Let's talk about music. Let's not talk about you being an hard guy. Let's talk about music. Let's talk about music. Let's not talk about being an hard man. Let's talk about music.
You're getting hung up on about. You're getting hung up about a situation that occurred on a boat.
Yeah, there must be truth behind every story you read about him. If Liam's, you know, lost some teeth in Germany, there's a reason why, and it's because Liam's Liam and he probably wound somebody up, you know what I mean? But sometimes the press reporting is, I don't know, it overshadows the music, doesn't it? Definitely. I think it's sad that happens, but that's the way it is. That's the nature of the beast, isn't it? If you're a rock and roll band that are into the excesses of rock and roll, the tabloids are going to concentrate on the excesses rather than the rock and roll, so that's the way it goes.
As well as overshadowing the music, the headline-grabbing antics of the Gallagher brothers also meant that the other members of the band, Paul McGuigan, Alan White and Paul Bonehead Arthurs, were often overlooked entirely.
Basically, Oasis was Griggsy and Bonehead started it, and then they got Liam, and then Noel joined later. And it was those 4, really, and, you know, their positions in it. You know, Griggsy was always the, he was the Henry Kissinger of the band. You know, the eruptions would erupt, and the next day it would be Griggsy, come on, Noel, let's go and have a drink, you know, and, you know, soothing the situation and calming the troubled waters, and, you know, I've seen him do it loads of times, you know. Me and Griggsy did a book about a footballer called Robin Friday, and we got interviewed by Hunter Davies, who wrote the authorised biography of the Beatles, and a great book about Tottenham Hotspur called The Glory Game. And Griggsy said to him, he said, I'm the luckiest guy alive. He said, I'm not a great bass player, you know. What I do functions in this group, you know. And Bonehead the same, you know.
They were certainly overshadowed by the other personas in the band, but as we've seen, those personas have carried that band through for 10 years after their creative peak, and they're still selling a lot of records, and the people are still interested in them. So perhaps the personas are actually more important than the music.
After Morning Glory's sonic blast of excess, the album finishes on a more contemplative and somewhat epic note. Champagne Supernova was a psychedelic journey that, 10 years on, still remains a firmly rooted fan favourite.
It's incredibly full of itself. It's incredibly portentous and bombastic, and it works. I mean, it's, you know, they really bet the farm on this one. It has the kind of sort of slightly strange and silly downpour sound effect introducing it. It builds and it builds and it builds. They sort of wrote Paul Weller in to contribute backing vocals and lead guitar, and it's Noel Gallagher, I think, sort of trying to reimagine Stairway to Heaven as played by Slade.
I think Champagne Supernova was the right tone at the time, because I mean what we had on the first record, the equivalent I guess would be Cigarettes and Alcohol, which was a big great rock song about our lives, you know, it's what we did at weekends, brilliant, you know, we all did it. Cigarettes and Alcohol, fantastic. And to know that they were still living that sort of hedonistic lifestyle with despite all the success, Champagne Supernova kind of encapsulates that.
He touched on, you know, sort of Oasis itself as this kind of supernova light that kind of flashed everywhere for 3 years, dropping champagne and cocaine wherever they went, you know, it had that kind of massive element to it. So I think it's a great closing statement. You know, and Liam's singing on that is really good as well. I really like his voice on that. I think he's really good on that.
It was Noel Gallagher saying, I can string any words together and it will seem like the most profound, insightful comment on the human condition known to mankind. And that's, I mean, it really is, it's just preposterous. Slowly walking down the hall faster than a cannonball is the worst line probably in British lyric history, certainly of the last 20 years.
How can you just slowly walk down a hall and yet still be faster than a cannonball? I mean, is the cannonball like rolling slowly? Has it got legs? Is it crawling? What? What's that mean? What are you on about?
I think that unless you've taken drugs, you aren't going to understand that. This is what I've heard anyway, because obviously I don't do drugs, but slowly walking down the hall faster than a cannonball is such a great drug lyric, because that's exactly what happens, you know.
You can imagine Noel writing it after a really frazzled night in a toilet cubicle somewhere. It says a hell of a lot about where Oasis were at that year and at that point in their career.
Although popular, Champagne Supernova also drew accusations of self-indulgence, a mindset which would plague Oasis on their follow-up album, Be Here Now, widely seen as the great folly of the Britpop era.
Be Here Now, certainly when stacked up against the first two albums, just sounded incredibly lifeless, dreary, pompous, full of itself, humourless, and yeah, just, you know, again in the context of what had come before it, one of the great dufferoos in modern rock and roll history.
Oasis fans at last got their hands on the group's new album, Be Here Now. It's their first for 2 years.
Why don't you like the album?
It's just the same old stuff. It's like, you know, guitar rock, dad rock, all the same.
I speak to Noel, last time I saw him, I was saying to him, Be Here Now is, well, it's not that good, is it, Noel? There's a few problems there. And I mean, the songs, I actually like the songs, a lot of the songs are really good in it, but God, they go on, they're about 8 minutes long. And he was going, yeah, but there's cocaine everywhere, everyone's telling I'm a genius. And I'm just going, that guitar sounds great, I'll put another guitar on, or another guitar on. And no one's telling him to say, stop, there's too many guitars on here.
Once you hit Be Here Now, you realise that as far as the records go, they were getting worse one by one. And I think they went one worse with the following one, Standing on the Shoulder of Giants. But I think since then they've done a couple of records that have kind of upped the game a bit. You can always, they're reliable now. Oasis albums are kind of reliable. There'll be one good ballad, there'll be 2 or 3 good rock songs on it. The rest will be sort of Oasis sounding filler. I mean, you know that it's going to sound like Oasis every single record.
I still like what they do, mate. Everything they bring out still excites me in some way. In Due Times is a great record, you know, I still play that, and I still find the music very exciting, and I always look forward to what they're doing. You know, and I don't think they're sort of never going to, I don't think they're ever going to surprise us with going in a different direction musically, but they don't need to really, do they? You know what I mean? It's like Heinz tomato soup is Heinz tomato soup. We don't want it to change, do we? You know what I mean? And I think we all want Oasis to carry on being a bit like how they've been since the start, really.
I don't think you'll see much of us in the near future for one reason or another, but we've got to sit down and see where we're going musically. There's a lot of things to sort out, you know.
They've had everything levelled at them, everything, negativity, positivity, all sorts. It doesn't matter. They are a business. 10 or 15 years' time, I hope they find the music. I hope they find what they're on about, really, you know. And I hope they start speaking, because they have a lot of influence over a lot of people. And I hope they start writing songs that mean something, that can get something changing, you know, and so Britain can become what we think it should be rather than what the politicians think.
Despite the arguable quality of their work since, nothing can take away the fact that, with Morning Glory, Oasis achieved what most bands can only dream of, defining a decade, selling countless million albums, and reintroducing rock and roll to a whole new generation.
Definitely maybe with such a statement, but I still think What's the Story is their best album. In the same way that everyone buys Sgt. Pepper, but, you know, Revolver is a better album.
If you want to know about 95 and 96, and if you're going to investigate Oasis, you have to have that album. Simple as that.
At the time did it seem like something kind of radically different, but it now stands as like, you know, one of the most kind of, you know, valid and lasting musical monuments of that era.
And it was just so out of the ordinary. There was no bog standard 4-time guitar chord, you know, boys rock.
It brought a radical edge to the mainstream, to stadium kind of rock culture.
In the summer of 1997, amidst the election of new Labour and the hysteria surrounding the death of Princess Diana, a previously obscure indie band from Oxford released their 3rd studio album. OK Computer established Radiohead as one of the most innovative and individual voices in modern music. This is a review of that album, and of the band who made it. Radiohead formed under the name On a Friday at Abington School on the outskirts of Oxford in the mid-1980s. After attending university and releasing several self-produced demos, the band was signed to a 6-album deal with EMI. Changing their name to Radiohead after the Talking Heads song, the group released their first full-length studio album, Pablo Honey, in 1993. The first single from the record, Creep, was to become an international hit. enormous success of Creep seemed, however, to sit uneasily with the song's author.
I think that Tom York was someone who he got stung by an early bit of criticism by Keith Cameron, a journalist, who called them a lily-livered excuse for a rock band. And I think from then on he had this sense that he wanted to do more than just front a white boy middle-class rock band. And you can hear that in the way that Pablo Honey turned into the Bends.
The Bends came out in 1995 against the backdrop of the Britpop explosion. The album became a huge success and marked the new maturity in Radiohead's songwriting.
The Bends distinguished them from a lot of what was going on in Brit rock at the time. I mean, it was just more interesting and daring than Oasis to me, or Blur or anything. It very much carved out its own sound and distinguished Radiohead from, you know, a lot of what was happening in Britain in the mid-90s.
At that time there was this sense of ambition, I think, that they had, which, you know, a lot of the Britpop bands at that time didn't really have. They had that limited Oasis kind of thing, and Radiohead did not want to get lumped in with that kind of sterility.
Because the Bends had sold so well, the record company didn't pander to them, but they gave them a little bit more leeway than they might have done a band on their debut album. So they found themselves in this position where they knew what they liked doing in the studio, and it was more that they had to engineer the way they worked, the way that they recorded, the way that they worked with producers and engineers. They wanted to make it so that the situation was engineered around them, rather than them having to fit in with the prescribed views of how you do these sort of things.
By January 1996, the band was ready to begin recording their third studio album. The freedom that the Bends had won them was to ensure that it was not to be a traditional recording process.
OK Computer was interesting because it was the first time, I think, that Radiohead got control over the recording process. They got their engineer in place, producer in place, Nigel Godrich, who they'd worked with a little bit before, and they built their own studio. And I think that was really important. They took control of the means of production in many ways.
They had worked with Nigel Godrich on the Bends on one track, Black Star, and they had they'd really. I think they said at the time that it felt like the teacher had gone away for the day, and they felt completely at ease in the studio to do what they wanted. So they got Nigel to build a portable studio that they could take anywhere that they wanted, and they found a mansion in Bath, which used to belong to Jane Seymour, and they went and recorded there.
In the autumn of 1996, Radiohead moved the production to St. Catherine's Court, a secluded 15th century mansion nestling in a picturesque valley just outside Bath.
And I think that's, you know, where the kind of ambience of St. Catherine's Court kind of came into play. That it didn't sound like a studio, it sounded bigger than a studio. It sounded like a church hall or a kind of, you know, a large sort of baronial dining room or something. It had those kinds of acoustics and ambience.
After mixing the record in London, the band were finally ready to release the first single, Paranoid Android. Coming in at over 6 minutes long, the song was accompanied by a rather unusual music video by Swedish cartoonist Magnus Carlsson.
Long tracks are usually made up of smaller bits, and in Paranoid Android there's 3 distinct sections really that come together. Any of them by themselves may not be particularly remarkable, but put together it creates this real epic, I think. The first section is relatively straightforward. The second section with the that section, that's probably as much as anywhere in the album where Radiohead and this particular album has its particular prog rock credential. That's the section which uses a little trick that wouldn't be out of place in Yes or Genesis in the 1970s.
there are moments of genuine bitterness, you know, the kind of the Gucci big and ambition. I think the key line in the thing is ambition makes you look very ugly, and that is almost an indictment of the 80s and 90s of you know, the prevailing mindset of the time, you know, that's being kind of, you know, commodified and is, you know, is taken to be the kind of the given mindset. I mean, we are supposed to be ambitious, and very, very few people question that, you know, very basic drive that is supposed to inform our lives. But I think that the kind of abrupt shift in gear when he says ambition makes you look very ugly is one of the key points. It's a very kind of, you know, it's a visual, it's almost like the kind of, the multi-tracks have been torn away at that particular moment. And it's in a song that I think is in lots of ways, you know, full of irony and full of various layers and perhaps a little bit of kind of self-mockery. It's a very straight moment.
The heavy riff that Johnny comes in on, which is kind of in line with the Creep riff, where he's almost trying to destroy the song because he doesn't like it, trying to make it less soppy.
And all of a sudden it kind of explodes and settles down on this particular chord sequence. The rain is falling down, and it's like this solitary individual in the middle of this kind of natural landscape.
I think its middle section that Johnny Greenwood wrote with the mellotron, you know, from rain down from a great height, I think is just, you know, extraordinarily beautiful, you know, is a brilliant contrast to the sort of grungier sections that kind of sandwich it.
Paranoid Android was released in May 1997, in the wake of New Labour's landslide victory in the national election. Despite being so long, the song was quickly adopted by radio stations across the country, and soon rose to number 3 in the UK charts.
Shocking record when that came out. As a single, it was 6 minutes plus. I mean, that was unheard of, you know, from punk. The idea of doing a single that lasted for longer than 3 minutes was just a heresy. You just don't do that. That was what the old farts did, ELP, yes. They didn't even make singles, you know, and it was just a territory that no one wanted to go near.
It set the level so high that this album's going to have to do something really special to stay at that particular pitch.
When the album was finally released on the 16th of June, the record's artwork was equally as remarkable as the first single had been.
I think there's a lot to be gained by attending to the artwork of this particular album. The idea of artworks being a particular aspect of rock albums goes back a long way, of course. I think it's very important. There are all sorts of little it's like little collages of images that are brought together. I said in the book, I think there's a small dissertation to be written on the colour blue itself in some of the artwork that you get with it.
The design of OK Computer and later Kid A, to a great extent, is very interesting. It's what probably people like Scrutiny Politti would have called mesthetics in some ways. There's this deliberate use of lowercase the whole time, which has become subsequently, and perhaps was at the time, a kind of sort of designery affectation that you'd get on the kind of logos of like offices in Old Street and places like that. But they use it in a kind of different kind of way, a more sort of pointedly sullen, deliberate sort of way. And they don't, and of course they also, their sleeves are sort of deliberate. There's lots of abrupt interventions and around and scribbles and scrawls, and the whole thing is deliberately kind of messed up and fucked up with and untidy.
It was pretty weird at the time. It didn't make any sense. There's nothing to latch onto. there are little tiny snippets to latch onto. It's like someone's taken an album cover and put it in the wash or something, and then it's come out sort of slightly blurred, slightly dyed. You recognise one thing, you recognise a sweet wrapper, you recognise the ingredients to a burger, you recognise some signs from an airport and a little family, the ideal family unit and all that. But it's all perverted, it's not as it should be, it's away, it's out of context. But like the way the lyrics work with the music, it becomes a sort of cohesive whole.
Actually, funnily enough, I think that the title OK Computer belongs as much to the artwork, really, as to something that pertains to the music itself.
A computer can't be okay. A computer can either be a 0 or a 1. It can't be a kind of moderate grey bit in the middle.
The album opened with the arresting guitar sound of Airbag, a song that reflected the band's new electronic influences, and more obscurely, Tom York's distaste for mechanised transport.
I just remember being so startled by it. It just seemed to take us into a new kind of era of rock. I mean, I remember people saying, you know, this is the first 21st century album. I mean, it just didn't sound like anything, you know, I'd ever heard before.
Band were quite keen to explore new music. They were obviously associated with DJ Shadow, and they've obviously grafted a little bit of that influence onto the track.
In some ways it mirrors Planet Telex from the previous album, which was again that dance meets rock kind of sound. Airbag was much more successful, I think.
You've got this kind of drum loop, this kind of sampling of a drum groove that Phil Selway played, which was then kind of used and looped in the track.
Airbag is, I think, the most uplifting Radiohead track in their whole canon, really. It's absolutely a burst of life, which is quite an achievement, because I think that's what they wanted to do. The lyrics concern themselves with the moment after a car crash, escaping a car crash, or being saved from a car crash.
Tom's paranoia about cars is perfectly expressed in that. And that's the subject he returns to throughout the album. But not just cars, but kind of modern transport, a kind of unease with being in metal boxes, being shunted along highways.
There's this wonderful "I'm back to save the universe" line, which is repeated, and that's, I guess, the sort of feeling that they're alluding to with escaping a car crash or being saved by an airbag. And the airbag is synonymous with that rescue, that sort of release from death.
Airbag is, yes, it's a curious introduction, and I think that it kind of sets the tone for the album, which is one of deep, deep sarcasm. You know, in this case, to this kind of, you know, ultimate sort of safety zone, you know, this more mechanistic convenience. And it's just one of the interesting general factors of OK Computer, that it's an album, I mean, if you think of like movements like punk and things like that, quite often that was a roar of protest against a time of nothing, really, which is what the 70s was, a time of desolation, it was a protest against a sort of poverty. Whereas OK Computer is a protest, in a sense, against a time of plenty, a time of like great material wealth, and just sort of trying to talk about how in some respects this makes life too safe, too comfortable, too functional.
After the epic Paranoid Android, the album moves into more traditional territory with Subterranean, Homesick, Alien.
I keep forgetting the smell of the warm summer air. I live in a town where you can't smell a thing. You watch your feet for cracks in the path.
I think he ran over a pheasant or something when he was out driving one night, and he was thinking about aliens watching from space.
On an album that really bears very little that you would call optimism. This is actually, I mean, there's a subtle difference between optimism and a certain kind of escapism. I mean, Johnny Greenwood was very much into the avant-garde, and he would probably be friendly with people like Sun Ra, whose whole idea was that the only way to escape this absolutely destitute, ruined, no-hope planet was to find salvation in the cosmos, you know, to travel off. You know, I don't think that Tom York actually believed that, but there's a song in which he appears to sort of have a wish for that kind of escape. There's an implication that you can't really fight the world. The world is buggered.
I wish that they swoop down in a country lane late at night when I'm driving. Take me on board their beautiful ship. Show me the world as I love to see.
But it's just a lovely adolescent dream, you know, on the part of somebody that's absolutely disaffected. And I think that's one of the songs that would have a sort of quite a sort of simple, but in some ways simple, in some ways profound appeal to its, you know, to the Radiohead audience.
There's this beautiful dreaminess to that song, which is very much like a Tim Buckley album called Happy Sad. Very warm, folky as well. And of course the title chimes in with Bob Dylan's Subterranean Homesick Blues. So there was a nice kind of a folk element to that. And coming after Paranoid Android, and it was a nice contrast, I think, to the first two tracks on the album.
With exit music for a film, Radiohead were actually asked to contribute the music for the end of Romeo and Juliet. And I think it's interesting that this is probably one of the very few, if not the only occasions when they were actually asked to write to order for a product, if you like. And yet they came up with probably one of the strongest songs on OK Computer.
Wake from your sleep to dry your tears today. We escape.
The whole thing was supposedly written for the Baz Luhrmann Romeo and Juliet film. The moment where they've just woken up the morning after they've consummated their relationship. Why didn't they run away, Tom thinks? Why didn't they just leave, you know, instead of hanging around and dying? You know, it would have surely made more sense to just get out of there. It's as if he could be in bed. It could be literally the morning after he's in bed with this kind of lullaby.
There is a kind of a streak running through OK Computer, and this is one very good example of it, of the sudden, very bitter, very misanthropic sort of moment. And you could say it's actually one of the kind of more sillier, I mean, if you were making a case against Radiohead, you could point to lines about, I hope you all choke, because it does seem like the kind of, you know, the sort of the student sitting on the stairs with his head buried in his hands at the party while everybody else is having fun, and that, you know, who's kind of transmitting his kind of lack of social status into this kind of apocalyptic worldview in which all the people that ignored him at parties and all the girls never got off him, you know, then they'll all be sorry when there's almost that kind of a hint of that kind of fantasy going on with the embittered artist.
It has that kind of orchestral presence, and I think it's very heartrending, and I'm sure that's to do with the way the chords are structured, etc.
This is one of those tracks which does Radiohead in a short amount of time. It starts very, very quietly, and at some point it absolutely soars. It's one of those tracks that goes further and further upwards. But it starts from something very simple. It's a simple minor key descending chord sequence. it's worth saying something about Tom York's voice. It's such a big part of Radiohead and this album. He has, I say in the book that it's his high range that does the damage. If he were to sing Happy Birthday to You slowly in that range, it's going to have an amazing effect.
I think Tom's an extraordinary vocalist. He's able to convey very human things. The way he's brave enough to sing things in the way that he is actually probably his defining characteristic. I think there's a reflection of the emotional honesty, which I do think is at the heart of Radiohead and the way he projects those songs.
One of my favourite moments on the album is when exit music stops and you've got that silence between that and Let Down. And then you've got that lovely, sweet guitar refrain that comes in that sets Let Down off. Melancholy about it as well, and I think to have real beauty, just to have something sweet isn't enough, but something bittersweet like that, and a song that's titled Let Down is obviously bittersweet as well.
Let Down is a classic example of OK Computer about where the music appears to be doing something that the lyrics aren't. It is a exceptionally despondent lyric, and yet musically it's one of the most rousing tracks. You know, on one level it's an absolutely rousing song, but it's almost this kind of, you know, this rapturous kind of cathedral-like tribute to utter misery.
The opening melody line has got something of the minimalists, people like Steve Reich and Philip Glass about it. So it's a little system that's going on that goes like this. And so on. So it's a little system that's going on there that could go on forever.
There is so much feeling and beauty in the music on this record, and I think, you know, on this song as much as anywhere else, and I think Jonny Greenwood has a lot to do with that. Greenwood, I just think, is a sort of instinctively a kind of a composer of genius, if you like. I think his musical contributions in terms of his sort of guitar overlays and arpeggios and the way that the guitars work with the keyboards on OK Computer is just staggeringly lovely, really. It's so beautiful.
And he's a virtuoso. He's basically capable of making sounds that nobody else gets anywhere close to.
The sixth track on the album, Karma Police, also became the second single to be released from the record. Reaching number 8 in the charts, the single has gone on to become one of Radiohead's most enduring songs.
One of the things that characterises Karma Police is the chord sequence at the opening, which can't really decide if it's in, as it were, C and A minor or E minor and G, and it's pulling between them. This may well be something that somebody would work out just at the piano, but there are things about this chord sequence which wouldn't make that much sense in terms of classical music, but it works nicely as a sequence itself.
think Karma Police is one of those Radiohead songs that expresses that kind of quiet desperation that Radiohead do so well, and obviously in some ways it's quite a bitter song. It's almost vengeful, and it is about, I think, justification and seeing things through and overcoming things. But there's a kind of quiet paranoia at work that actually comes through towards the end.
People who do wrong, one day their wrongs will catch up with them. You know, it's the very nature of karma, but there is this task force of people that go around, the Karma Police, who can suddenly exact revenge or recompense upon these people who've done wrong.
This is what you'll get. This is what you'll get. This is what you'll get when you mess with us.
This is what happens if you mess with us. Again, very, very sort of sinister. It's almost like, you know, the idea of the army of me, that there is this kind of mass of disaffected people that will somehow or other get their act together. It's a kind of weird mixture of, in some ways, perhaps of like wishful fantasy and hopefully sinister intention.
The kind of chorus, if you like. James Doheny is somebody I've read who spotted that as possibly referring to the track Sexy Sadie on the Beatles' White Album.
Sexy Sadie, what have you done? You made a fool of everyone. You made a fool of everyone. Sexy Sadie, oh, what have you done?
It's a standard pop song so far, a little ploddy if anything. And then in the middle of the song, it just lifts, and you get this beautiful sequence, Tom York in its higher range. This lovely thing, for a minute there, I lost myself. And the thing I always liked about it was the word few. He always says that word, few, for a minute there, I lost myself.
For a minute there, I lost myself. I think of explosions in life when we suddenly something comes out of the ordinary, and explosions in art and music that I think Radiohead are very capable of, and they do that, the way that songs break out from this calm. You know, I think of Polanski films and things like that, where things are, or Hitchcock, and then suddenly you get this jolt. And I think that Tom York is obviously a very sensitive man. He's very renowned for that. And it chimes in with his kind of personality, a line like that.
Fitter, Happier. It's interesting how in the sort of sleeves, it isn't quite part of the listings. It's almost a kind of adjunct to the rest of the album. And it's a kind of litany of all of the things that you are supposed to do as a kind of well-functioning human being in this particular society.
Fitter, happier, more productive, comfortable, not drinking too much, regular exercise at the gym, 3 days a week.
And also what the song does by listening in that kind of way, in that very, very sardonic way, is to expose their inadequacy. And in terms of, if you actually have any kind of notion in your head of what it might be to live in a radicalized society, then these things aren't the things that will get you there. These are the kind of values that you've got to find a way of dispensing with.
With Fitter, Happier, I think Tom's made it very explicit that he was actually looking at a lot of the kind of self-help manuals that sell in abundant quantities to people who are looking for something that's missing in their life. And I think the way in which he tackled that in basically preparing a wish list was very, very effective.
If you believe there just might be something you can do in the next 10 days that would make your personal life, your family life, and your business life better, can I see your hands, please? How many of you believe the choice is yours? How many of you believe every choice has an end result? There is something I can specifically do that will make my future either better or worse.
If you do all these things, if you tick every box, it's not necessarily going to produce any kind of happiness in your life.
That is a kind of a bitter piece, really, I think, because it's made up of all these phrases, goals, wishes that the ordinary, vaguely successful, vaguely affluent kind of student or 20-something would kind of want out of life. And I think York feels uncomfortable with that. For some reason, it's something that he's almost felt oppressed by, I think, in a way.
Dinners and saturated fats, a patient better driver, a safer car, baby smiling in backseat, sleeping well, no bad dreams, no paranoia, careful to all animals, never washing spiders down a plug hole, keep in contact with old friends, enjoy a drink now and then, will frequently check credit at Moral, Bank, Hole in Wall, favors for favors, fond but not in love.
Behind the voice, there's some kind of studio computer sounds going on, and there's the makings of a little tune there. There are just 2 chords, and just behind it you can just about hear a track like this, an old film theme. You might be able to hear something like that. It's not a kind of French movie kind of music in the background there. Again, the juxtaposition of these very kind of unemotive words with this just hint of something quite emotional behind it. It's a lovely juxtaposition, and I think.
Better, healthier, and more productive, a pig in a cage, on antibiotics.
Electioneering's a strange one. To me, it sounds the oldest of all the songs on OK Computer. It could come from the bends. It doesn't want to sit down with the rest of the songs. It's up. And it lifts you back up out of the weirdness of Fitter Happier, I guess, as well.
On the surface, it seems to be a bit of a jibe at the way that politicians conduct themselves. And I'd heard the story that Tom, actually on tour in America, was basically shaking hands and saying, you know, can I guarantee your vote in the forthcoming election, etc. But I think what it actually embodies is his own anxiety about the position that he is in. I think it basically seems to me more powerfully about his compromises as a rock star, as somebody who actually is in the business of selling records, and his complete discomfort with that.
Despite the fact that the song had been written many months before Tony Blair's new government came into office, for many, the sentiment behind it perfectly sums up the New Labour project and its effect on modern politics.
You know, there's a huge wad of cynicism in there, you know, in terms of what's happening with contemporary politics. I think Tom York at that stage was educating himself very well. I mean, he was reading stuff like Hobsbawm's Age of Extremes, a Marxist view of the 20th century. He was reading Will Hutton's The State We're In. Learning, you know, as you should do when you're an artist like that and you're, you know, in the public eye. I mean, he takes his responsibilities quite keenly and carefully, I think, which is good. I think a lot of the trouble with rock, it's just in this, it's in its own little bubble a lot of the time. And what I like about Radiohead and Tom York in particular, that he makes it engage with the real world and contemporary issues. And I think that's one of the crucial things about OK Computer. People don't quite understand what the concept was, but they knew it was a critique in many ways of a lot that's happening in contemporary society.
In 1997, I think there were an awful lot of people at the time who were infused with this great sense of optimism at Tony Blair coming in, getting rid of the Tories. Quite a lot of people did buy into that idea at the time, and, you know, were filled with that things can only get better optimism. But really, in that lyric, Tom York pretty much nails Like a Tony Blair. I think that anyone looking back now would see that retrospectively. It wasn't even that for a lot of people the scales fell from their eyes with Tony Blair, but with Tom York the scales weren't even in his eyes in the first place.
In some ways, you know, Climbing Up the Walls is the most opaque or oblique lyric on the album. It's quite unclear exactly what York is saying with this track. It's certainly one of the more kind of intense sort of passages on the record. Sense of sort of domestic menace, you know, his preoccupation with demons. There is something quite sort of disturbing about this track. And what is it that's climbing up the walls? What is the I in this track?
Maybe it's from Tom York's individual experience, who knows? It may be something about our darkest nightmares.
Lyrically, it's a bit like songs like Every Breath You Take. There's an element of that in there about the idea of the sheer insidiousness of the song, the insidiousness of the narrator. It's really kind of quite a nasty song.
But it kind of climaxes in this unholy and scary sort of tempest of strings and other treated effects.
The band talked about being influenced by Penderecki. A time in popular music where more and more artists are using orchestras in a very conventional, studied way. And I think what was great about that track was that it actually mixed the influences. So although the violins were there, they were all tuned to different kind of textures, and the time signatures were all messed about.
The arrangement, if you like, is something that's quite in addition to the song. It's not just a kind of emphasizing of a bass line or the chord sequence. It's a real kind of integral part of the track, as it were.
In January 1998, Radiohead released the final single from OK Computer, No Surprises.
I think No Surprises, again, works very effectively. It's kind of an anti-nursery rhyme in many ways, because in some ways the musical elements are very reassuring. They're very pretty, but the lyric is much darker.
When we come to talk about No Surprises, I wonder whether Radiohead would have remembered a track by the Smiths called Girlfriend in a Coma, which was a kind of ultimate example of Morrissey's kind of perversity in a way, where there's this incredibly jolly track and Morrissey saying the words, "Girlfriend in a coma, I know it's really serious."
Girlfriend in a coma, I know it's serious. Girlfriend in a coma, I know it's really serious.
The music is telling a completely different story to the words. So here you have a set of words which, if you were to read them on the page, might give you quite a creepy sense of again, paranoia, suicide, those kinds of thoughts. But in music, which is fragile and beautiful and tender, almost childlike.
Best opening line, it's like a heart that's full up like a landfill. It's like a landfill and a heart. A heart is the middle of the human emotion, the human body, and a landfill, which is where you put rubbish. It's on the edge of a town. It doesn't have any purpose other than to get filled with crap. And to compare those two things in the opening line of a song, that's genius. That's just brilliant, really.
The single peaked at number 4 in the UK charts. However, despite its success, there is still some debate about the song's meaning.
Lyrical subject matter, which is hinting at the notion of suicide as a merciful release. I don't think that Tom York and Radiohead ever intend to adapt anything that's adapted Suicide Solution, any of those heavy metal songs. And I don't think that anyone's going to top themselves after Radiohead. But it's more about something more subtle. It's more about the fantasy of absenting yourself from this world from which you feel absolutely disaffected, and couching that in kind of very sort of dramatised terms.
People really do go to sleep. They really sleepwalk through their lives. And this song, I think, really says that, that if you're not prepared to risk alarms and surprises, you're not really living. And I'm with him on that. I think you do have to. You have to kind of, you have to take those risks. Life is, the fully lived life is full of alarms and surprises.
The penultimate song on the album, Lucky, began life in 1995 when it was released as part of the Help album, a compilation record designed to raise money for the War Child charity.
I mean, Lucky, in a sense, is the sort of birth of OK Computer, because it was this track recorded quite quickly with Nigel Godrich for the War Child album, and it was such a good experience for the band that it got them thinking about new ways of recording. They wanted to take more control over their own work.
They decided to include it and kept going back to it, thinking, well, we need to make it different. And I think that old aesthetic of you don't put previously released things on your album was at play there. But actually they found that they could do nothing with it, that it was a finished piece and there was nothing more they could do to improve it.
I'm on a roll. I'm on a roll. This time I feel my luck could change.
Lucky's about the same sort of thing as Airbag, where you just escape death, or someone rescues you, the airbag saves you, or you're pulled out of the wreck of a crashed plane, or something like that.
If you're involved in a terrible crash, an airplane or a car crash, but you've survived, then what do you think about that? What does one feel about that? Is it the great relief of being alive, or is it about the horror that's at one's side?
If there's anything that might resemble a glimmer of hope, then I think that Lucky, albeit in this very twisted and heavily qualified way, is that.
OK Computer is going to be quite an album to finish, and I think Radiohead did the sensible thing, which was to go out with a relatively calm, distanced, reflective kind of track.
It was one of the pre-St Catherine's Court tracks that they did in the fruit shed in Oxfordshire, and it was kind of, it went on the shelf and then then it wound up on the record. So I mean, it clearly wasn't something that they necessarily set that much store by, but when they listened to it again, it seemed to provide the perfect ending for the record.
As I understand it, Johnny wrote it about being in a beautiful square in France and actually observing tourists being bustled around and not actually taking the time to engage with what was going on around them.
And then it kind of builds to this really quite kind of sort of desperate plea for, to slow down. Let's slow down.
Slow down, you idiots. And I think that it is, again, a deliberate sort of assault against a society that in all kinds of ways, through excessive mechanisation, through kind of like increased, voracity of economic growth, blah, 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 is moving far too quickly.
Where the hell am I going? I mean, it forces all of us to ask that question, because I think most of us are running to stand still in the early 21st century. We really do not take time out to ask ourselves, where we're going or why we're going there.
OK Computer was released on June 16, 1997. Its critical reception was unprecedented and remains almost unrivalled in modern music.
I mean, I think from the point of view of someone who'd been writing about music for, I don't know how long I'd been, 15, almost 20 years maybe, I'd given up on the prospects of an album coming out that just totally blew you away.
The critical reception that OK Computer received when it came out in 1997 really was quite extraordinary, quite exceptional. It was instantly making people's critics' top 10, top 5 all-time lists or even higher.
The acclaim didn't surprise me, I have to say. I think like everybody, I mean, like everyone who reviewed it, you just had to you had to kind of bow down before it.
Radiohead toured OK Computer relentlessly and earned high praise as a live act. The record's success was sealed with the group's legendary performance at Glastonbury, 1997.
I think Glastonbury was probably quite an easy thing a hook to pin on the success of OK Computer. It was not an exemplary gig. It was going hideously wrong because the monitors weren't working, as is well documented, and it was just a Radiohead gig, and it happened to be at Glastonbury. Glastonbury's always a special gig, especially if you're headlining, because it's a bloody massive crowd. There's 200,000 people watching you, maybe more. Who knows who got in over the fences, and it's a defining moment. Bands like Pulp have gone on to say that they'll never ever better that moment. But for Radiohead, it was you kind of think, yeah, that could only happen to Radiohead. It all went a bit wrong. It was one of the wet Glastonburys, which are always slightly more depressing because it's like the trenches. It's like wartime trenches at Glastonbury when it's wet. You kind of lose your mind. And everyone was kind of not quite... Obviously, if you're in the crowd, you don't know what's going on. Radiohead are playing, the monitors aren't working, so what? You can hear it coming out the speakers. They just can't hear themselves. So Tom can't hear his voice, they can't hear the guitar parts or any of the instruments. It's just completely guesswork, if you like. But I think Tom called out, turn the lights on the audience or something. So if you like, the house lights were turned on, and you could just see, or he could just see this massive sea of people. And it went from, it flipped. It went from being horrendous for them, not so horrendous for the crowd. It was a Radiohead gig. They were seeing a good enough gig, to being mind-blowing. It was adversity. It was triumph in the face of adversity. They just pulled it off. They just played. The album had been pretty much circulating, I guess, for a month maybe. Yeah, or it was on the cusp of release, or people had it. So the songs were known. They were singing along. Everything started to work. There was a sense of elation in the band. You could see it was like, yeah, we did it. We triumphed. This could have been absolutely bloody awful, but we pulled it out of the bag. It was like a success, really.
Amongst all the praise and publicity surrounding the record, one key question kept on being raised. Is OK Computer a concept album? The argument was principally over whether or not the record was about the dehumanising effects of modern culture.
In a sense, you could make anything a concept album just by putting the themes together. As I say, what I did with this album was try and look for linkages between the songs, setting out how some of the words in particular formed clusters of ideas. And yes, then one can end up with a particular set of obsessions that happen here. I don't think in the end that's enough to really make it as a concept album.
If you ask Tom York, is it a concept album, of course he would say no, because that very term probably sends shivers down his spine. And I mean, it's not a concept album in the sense that it is about any one subject, but it does feel like an album that takes you on a journey through, 2 or 3 sort of key themes.
I do think it is a concept album in that it addresses across the songs essentially the existence of people nowadays in modern society and their struggles to come to terms with that.
The best rock music in many ways, I think, is about people trying to place themselves or deplace themselves or in the society they find themselves in or that they want to escape from. And I think OK Computer is very much like that. It's the sound of an alienated man, I think, who's looking around him and looking at other people, and it's the sound of a frightened person as well, actually. And I mean, there's a lot of fear in late 20th century, early 21st century culture, and OK Computer really does give off that. But I don't think it's a concept album in that A to Z kind of, here is a narrative.
Since the record's release in 1997, it has gone on to top several polls and earn accolades from a wide spectrum of the music industry. It has even been referred to as the final classic record of the past millennium.
They came almost like an avant-garde band who were playing stadiums, and that was, for me, I didn't really think you could do that. That was possible, really, in rock music anymore.
They were trying to push things as far as they could, and I think they were honest about that. I think the emotions beneath the album are still really honest, even though there's a lot of technical things which, in the wrong hands, could be experiments in technical prowess, but I don't think that happens with OK Computer.
Almost like an album which in itself represents a whole culture that isn't really being emulated by any of their peers or contemporaries. It's a sort of standalone voice, but an entirely appropriate one. It's for its rebelliousness, its disdainfulness, and there are precious few people, either kind of emulating those things or doing them in such a kind of rich and variegated way musically, doing it in such an intelligent way, that an album like OK Computer is like a counterculture in itself.